Okay, hello, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to this webinar on co-benefits of addressing climate change and air pollution. My name is Karma Yangzom. I am the Principal Environment Specialist in the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of ADB. So today's webinar, I'm very pleased to mention that it is co-hosted by IGIS, the Institute of Global Environmental Strategies based in Japan, and also the Asian Co-Benefits Partnership. So the webinar today is the fourth of a series of air quality webinars that we have been organizing since September 7th. We had the first webinar on September 7th to celebrate the first International Day of Clean Air for Blue Skies. So today's webinar, we will be having it broken into three different segments. The first one, we will try to understand the concepts of co-benefits and the thought process that goes into defining co-benefits. We will hear a little bit about that from two of our panelists. Following that, we will go specifically into looking into project design to seek climate finance. And we will hear from our colleague on the Future Carbon Fund that is being managed in ADB. And we will also get to hear about the Green Climate Fund and their requirements on accessing climate finance. And the last segment of the webinar will be a panel discussion on reconciling views and taking forward co-benefits in Asia. And in each of the three segments, we have kept some time for interaction with the audience, roughly about 10 minutes per segment. So roughly in total, we have about 30 minutes. So I would really like to invite and encourage our participants to pose your questions or comments in the chat box, or if you want to verbally put your question up, you can also please just reach out to us. So actually, co-benefits, this is something which I personally, I do understand and I've heard about it, but I do not have much experience in working on, projects with co-benefits and quantifying co-benefits. So I am also very keen to learn more about this today. So we have a total of 5 panelists today, and I will introduce them one by one later, right before they present, and just to save on time. Without any further delay, we will move to the first session, the first segment of the webinar. And our first presenter is Dr. Eric Sussman. So Dr. Eric Sussman is the Research Director of the Center for Sustainability and Governance at IGIS. He has a bachelor's degree in Mandarin Chinese from Rutgers University, a dual master's degree in public policy and Asian studies from the University of Texas. He has a PhD in political science from the University of California. And for most of the past 2 decades, he has conducted research on environmental issues in Asia. This has included working with China's Yellow River Conservancy Commission. He is currently serving as a lead author in one of the chapters for the 6th assessment report of the IPCC climate change report, particularly chapter 17. So, of course, there are many more achievements of Eric, but in the interest of time, I've just highlighted a few of his achievements. And Eric, I would now like to invite you to make your presentation. And if you can please finish your presentation in 8 minutes. Okay. If you can put it on the presentation mode, Eric.
Yeah. Great. Okay, thank you so much, Karma. It's a pleasure to be here today. The title of my presentation is Co-Benefits of Addressing Climate Change and Air Pollution. And I think what I'm going to do is offer a brief overview of the concept of co-benefits, make some linkages to work on air pollution, and then close with some of the work we're doing here at IGIS to try to ensure co-benefits serve as a basis for decision making. So to begin with, the term co-benefits is actually about 30 years old or so. And it was conceived at a time when people were concerned over the costs of investing in climate change, especially long-term climate change. And the idea really was that if we can find additional benefits from a climate change policy, like improvements in air quality or improvements in health, or even new technologies, or even greater energy access, these type of benefits would offset the costs of investing in mitigating greenhouse gases. And this would make it a lot more palatable for policymakers and politicians to invest in mitigating those greenhouse gases. And so there was a series of studies done about 30 years ago where they would model the different types of benefits that could come out of a carbon tax or emissions trading scheme. And from that, they would be able to show that, okay, in many cases, actually, you would save a lot of money if you factored in these different benefits. Now, what's happened over the past 30 years is this term has taken on some different dimensions. One of them, which is kind of illustrated in this diagram, is rather than focusing on sort of this sweet spot, this Venn diagram, where you have climate change policies leading to development co-benefits, one different interpretation has sort of switched these arrows around and basically said, we need development policies that would lead to climate co-benefits. And this was particularly important in developing country contexts where you have an economic policy, an environment policy, or a social policy, and then some of the additional benefits were considered the climate co-benefits. Now, yet a third way of looking at co-benefits is what we'll call an air pollution perspective. And this air pollution perspective began to gather a lot of momentum about a decade ago or so. And it really focused on different types of air pollutants, especially what are known as short-lived climate pollutants, such as this sooty black carbon that you sometimes see coming out of diesel vehicles, or if you've ever seen a cook stove that emits some of this soot. And it also includes a secondary pollutant known as tropospheric ozone. Now, these short-lived climate pollutants would go up into the atmosphere for a relatively short period of time, much shorter than your greenhouse gases. And then when you would remove them, you would be able to not only improve air quality, improve public health, but also reduce warming in the near term. And so from an atmospheric science perspective, co-benefits, one way of achieving co-benefits is targeting these short-lived climate pollutants. And a lot of these are in this PM 2.5, which is one of the big pollutants that we see here in Asia, of course. And so you have these three perspectives: a climate perspective, a development perspective, and an air pollution perspective on co-benefits. And they all began to sort of gradually come together. And that's one of the reasons they've come together is a report that myself and several other colleagues, over 107 authors, contributed to, 53 different reviewers. And this report is entitled Air Pollution in Asia and Pacific, Science-Based Solutions. It was published last year. And if you go to the website of the Climate Change and Clean Air Coalition, or UNEP, you can find out more about the report, but I'm just going to hit some of the key points. I mean, one of the key points that we raise in this report is that air pollution is a public health crisis in Asia. Only about 8% of the population in the region, that's about 4 billion people, do not, okay, 8% of the population breathe air that's within WHO standards, or 4 billion people do not breathe air that's in WHO standards, and that's 10 micrograms per cubic meter of PM 2.5. You can see from this diagram from the report that a lot of the hot spots are in India and China, but there are also hotspots in Southeast Asia as well, and this is a really big concern. So one of the things that my colleagues at the IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, who did the modeling for this report, they did is they said, okay, we want to try to achieve reductions in air pollution, And they found 3 different types of measures that could lead to reductions in PM 2.5. One are what is known as the Asia-wide conventional controls. These are actually your typical end-of-the-pipe type solutions like denitrification or desulfurization. Sometimes you also could say emission standards on tailpipes. And so that's one category. And ironically here, a lot of these solutions are not going to lead to significant co-benefits. In fact, they might lead to increases in greenhouse gases because there's more energy used to remove pollution at the end of the pipe. Now there's a second category, these next generation air quality measures. Now these next generation air quality measures are going to focus on your short-lived climate pollutants like the black carbon. So you're going to include in this category things like brick kilns or diesel engines. And these are going to give you co-benefits in terms of near-term reductions in climate pollutants, as well as improvements in air quality and public health. And then the last category are what we call development priority solutions. And these solutions are focusing on typically on larger energy installations, so renewable energy, energy efficiency. And in this case here, you're focusing primarily on sort of a more climate perspective on co-benefits. Here you're going to get your reductions in long-term greenhouse gases, and you're also going to get improvements in air quality from reduction in criteria pollutants, and also some reductions in PM 2.5. So one of the things that the report showed is, okay, there's 3 categories of solutions. I'm not going to go into great detail here, but here are some of the specific technologies or solutions that fall into these 3 different categories. So the conventional controls include like your post-combustion controls, the next stage air quality measures. So here you, once again, you have your brick kilns, but you also have pollution from agricultural crop residues, residential waste burning, and interestingly also livestock manure management. So you're getting agricultural sources in here. And most of these sources tend to be relatively small scale and dispersed. And then the last category of solutions, again, is your development priority solutions. And this is going to give you more of your climate co-benefits perspective with energy efficiency, renewable energy. You're also going to get wastewater treatment and coal mining in this category as well. Now, the interesting thing about these solutions is if you would implement all 25 solutions across Asia, this would lead to significant improvements in air quality. In fact, on average, you might get down to about 20 micrograms per cubic meter, which is getting you on your way to the WHO guidelines. And you can see from this map right here what that might look like in terms of concentrations. Now, one of the key things that I want to highlight is in terms of actually implementing these solutions. So one of the really important things that we've noticed is once you've identified the different types of solutions, it's going to be increasingly important for your air pollution, climate change, and other sectoral agencies to work together. And you're also going to need to have good coordination, especially in terms of fiscal decentralization between your local and national governments. And so we call for a lot of what we have named this multi-level governance model, and also bringing in additional stakeholders. So sometimes you call it multi-level, multi-stakeholder governance, where you're engaging, we call the ABCs. This is your academics, your businesses, as well as civil society and other stakeholder groups. Having good coordination and good stakeholder engagement is going to be critical to implementing many of the solutions, and especially in terms of developing the policies that will bring together these different solutions in a coherent strategy. Now, the last few things I'd like to highlight is if you're very interested in these issues, and I hope you are, we'd love for you to sign up for our Asian Co-Benefits Partnership. It's cobenefit.org, and there you'll find our most recent white paper. And the white paper basically took off where the solutions report ended and made the claim that in order to implement some of these solutions, you're going to need good governance, like I suggested before, this multi-level, multi-stakeholder governance, but also in some ways squaring the circle is to bring in some of the carbon finance that's been coming online through different carbon finance mechanisms. And this will help implement some of your solutions, either through green Green Climate Fund, or I think our colleague Dr. Degal will talk a little bit about some of the future carbon fund that the ADB has. And this will help achieve, obviously, reductions in climate change agents, but also achieve other development benefits. And these development benefits don't end with air pollution. They include some of the things under the SDGs, which my colleague, or the Sustainable Development Goals, which my colleague Joni will talk about in just a bit. And then this is just the last point, is the Asian Co-Benefits Partnership, and this is our website. Please stop by if you have some time. Thank you very much, and I look forward to an engaging dialogue throughout.
Thank you, Eric. Very clear presentation and some good points there about the different kinds of solutions that are out there. We would now like to move on to our next speaker, and I see that we already have a comment in the chat box, so we will discuss the comment in the Q&A after Joni's presentation. So I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Joni Jupesta. He actually just joined the Research Institute of Innovative Technology for the Earth. It's right, the acronym is right, as a senior researcher just this month. This organization is based in Japan as well. He did his postdoctoral research training at United Nations University, and he has also been selected as a lead author of for a working group to prepare the 2021 IPCC report, the 6th assessment report. And recently, he has edited a book called Climate Change Research, Policy and Actions in Indonesia, Science, Adaptation and Mitigation. And it is going to be published this month in October by Springer Nature. So Dr. Joni, I hand over the floor to you. If you can please finish your presentation within 8 minutes.
Thank you. I would like to discuss about what is the relation between the Sustainable Development Goals and the climate change. In this context, we are focusing on the mitigation and what is the relation with the air pollution. As you are aware on this presentation, this is the illustration of the IPCC report 1.5. This is so several scenario how to mitigate the greenhouse gas emission, and with the help of the net emission technology. For example, when we apply the carbon capture and storage, which is work a lot on this issue, and also we can also pursuing the negative emission from the afforestation, forest and land use by planting more trees scheme, and also we have the scheme by energy efficiency, which is Eric already mentioned in related with the co-benefit. In this chapter, I would like to discuss about our chapter in IPCC. IPCC several times criticized to mention too much number on the modeling, and yet what is the connection with the Sustainable Development Goal is still unclear. That's why our chapter is developed to bridging what is the relation between the climate change and the Sustainable Development Goals. For example, here the current situation of the economy is uncertain, and we propose how to make it the circular economy by zero waste, and also the current governance focusing on the monetary, and we propose how to balancing between the economy, market, and policy itself, and innovation more focusing on the industrial. We thought consider environment. We propose the new approach by focusing on the more sustainable energy supply. For example, psychology term also in this chapter, while people has the paradigm focusing on the money first, and we propose some stimulation on the mind, change the mindset, and while we are talking about the long term instead of the short term trajectory. On the chapter we proposing several chapters already proposed on the very sectoral approach. For example, the energy sector, the building sector, the transport sector. But but there is lack of, actually the sectoral cannot see from one single sectoral, but it's more in multi-sectoral. That's why our chapter is proposing the interconnection, the nexus, for example, the water energy nexus. You want to do some industrial activity, but you produce a lot of, you consume a lot of energy, but yet you produce some food as the result for consumer goods, and yet you consume also a lot of water. We want to see what is the trade-off between the water, energy, food in this context. The other thing is about the social inclusion. The other chapter is focusing on the quantification of the greenhouse gas emission, but we believe there's some lack of the issue of the social inclusion because yet poverty still do exist, and how to incorporate the poor people into which is the most climate vulnerable. This is very important for the IPCC. Several case study we propose here. Digitalization, this is very important for the future in long run, and we also talking about the food waste. Many people has a lot of food production thanks to GMO, but how many people also undermine the food waste, and we want to highlight about this issue. And also this chapter mentioned about the importance of the renewable, the carbon scheme, and also the fossil fuel phased out in transition way. We cannot radically change the fossil fuel dramatically, especially in the fossil fuel dependent country. So we have to propose this is in transition trajectory, not radical innovation, but we are more focusing on the transition. On also the issue of the agriculture, food and land use. As you're already aware, the Asia Pacific still dependent on a lot of the agriculture base, and this is big issue of the air pollution because the excessive consumption of the fertilizer, pesticides, and also imbalance about the water management for some of the fertilizer could be goes to the river and make the environment damage in the water, and also the water I already mentioned, and also the low carbon, how the city can approach into low carbon city by the rapid urbanization, the better planning, infrastructure and transportation. This sectoral case study we also highlight about the co-benefit of the transportation by using the, like for example, car sharing, for example, and stranded assets. Also, we highlight about the social movement and education. This is very important, as you are already aware, the Arab Spring and so on, how to change the paradigm. In our team, yes, we are very multidisciplinary team in our chapter. We are not only seeing from one single perspective, we also have psychology, political science, economics, engineering, and other disciplinary. In the conclusion, it's very difficult to say only one single factor can make it sustainable development goal or climate change mitigation, but but several factors do play important enabling condition, and the factor range from the technology and social innovation, and the shifting of market policy and governance arrangement, and also change in belief system and market force. The transition is follow context specific, so we cannot say what one single prescription, what good for this country is not necessarily good for another country. Some country has the landlocked situation, some country facing the vulnerable because coastal area, some country has the different issue because they are very vulnerable by scaling, very small and island country. I look forward for further discussion about this issue on the next session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joni. We look forward to reading the report when it comes out next year. Looks like there is a lot of food for thought that is going into this chapter. And we have a couple of minutes to discuss questions from the audience. And actually, it's more of a comment and sharing of information from Anthony Reed Harvey. And Joni, you had just talked about, you know, the importance of the role of poorer segments of society in addressing climate change. And I think this is very closely linked to the point that Anthony here has mentioned about where the poor are entirely capable of their own production and implementation of clean cook stoves. Before I ask you, I was wondering, if Anthony, would you like to, speak and share your view on this? It's very interesting to hear this point from you.
Yes, I'd be happy to.
Yes, please.
Well, I can tell you, we have done one project so far with these insulating ceramic rocket stoves in the far west of Tanzania. Up to now, it hasn't been funded so much, but up to now, the 4 clay workers who are producing these stoves actually, as of 16 months ago, had produced 48 of these stoves. You'll notice in the presentation of the link that I put into the chat box that I'm suggesting that people use molds to produce these stoves, which will greatly simplify the task. Those in Tanzania have not had the advantage of molds, but have still, by 15 months ago, placed 48 of these stoves in low-income households. Actually, the Tanzania government public health officer of Kabondo district did put one of these stoves into the kitchen of the Kabondo district hospital, which means that the women who are cooking in the hospital are not breathing smoke. Now, these can easily be produced, starting with those who work with clay, producing such simple products as water containers, cook pots, and construction brick. Once they know the mass production techniques of models and molds, they can easily produce these stoves. The added benefit, of course, is that because these will burn biomass, or for that matter, briquetted agricultural waste with no smoke at all, there will be no need for the production of charcoal or carbonized fuel.
Right. I think that's a great point, and it's some kind of technology which can easily be adopted to many other countries, and especially in Asia, where this indoor air pollution is a big challenge. And I just want to thank you, Anthony. I think it's very, very early for you in the morning, but you're still up to attend this webinar. Really appreciate that.
Well, it's important.
Thank you very much. Joni, would you like to comment on the point from Anthony? And then maybe after Joni, even if Eric, you would like to say anything on this point?
Yes, I will. Thank you very much to point at this, Anthony. Actually, I regarding you in indoor air pollution, I forgot to mention several countries. This is big issue in Asia Pacific because the Asia is traditionally rely on biomass, and one of the issue is the clean cooking. A lot of people still cooking by using the wood, which is not healthy, which is one of the cause of the indoor air pollution. But the solution is for example, in Indonesia case, Indonesia government proposed the LPG, liquid petroleum gas, because Indonesia has a lot of gas. So, but I also heard about your solution, the biomass, which is without smoke at all, and I'm very interested to know more about this issue.
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you, Joni. Eric, would you like to quickly react to this point as well?
Sure. Yeah, thanks so much for getting up with us, Anthony. It's greatly appreciated. And I think it's really appropriate. I mean, you picked in terms of those 25 solutions I shared, that's the single one with the greatest potential for air quality improvement. And it also, I mean, of course, the cook stoves release a lot of black carbon. So this is a big problem for climate change as well. I fully agree with you that a lot of times these solutions are organic and homegrown. In fact, we did a project with the Asian Development Bank 3 years ago on climate change and gender issues. And part of the project was starting some pilot projects in Laos working with SNV and the Lao Women's Union. And the idea here was to enable women's groups to get involved in the manufacturing of cook stoves and the marketing of the cook stoves and the sale of the cook stoves. And then also to bring that within the climate policy and the planning frameworks. The point that I just want to highlight is that, there's good interactions sometimes when you have these social environmental issues. The last point is, in terms of the solutions themselves, I think, different communities have different needs, but I think the point that you put your finger on is that to enable people and empower people to engage in their own solutions is critically important. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric. And thank you again, Anthony. And we will include the link, the document that you have mentioned. We will include it in the webinar webpage. So we'll have a webpage for this webinar, and we will share it as one of the resource materials. We also have another comment, and I think this is also got to do with sharing information. It's from Rosena Fedelius, and it's basically looking, it's sharing information about, doing a better job in terms of using renewable organic materials from waste. So thank you very much for this suggestion, and we will also check out the website that you have posted and also try to share it as a resource as part of the webinar webpage. So since we are running slightly behind time, I think we should move to the next part, the next section of the webinar. We would now like to move on to the discussion on the project design for climate change. And we now have Mr. Virender Dugal. He is the Principal Climate Change Specialist in ADB. He works in the same department as me. Virender is a fund manager of the Future Carbon Fund. This is a trust fund that is managed by ADB, and he has a wealth of knowledge and experience in the areas of climate change, carbon finance, and trust fund management. He has worked extensively with multilateral, public, private, and private sector institutions with expertise in the areas of project development, portfolio management, advisory services, technology transfer, and strategic collaborations. And he has done a lot of leadership and teamwork in working in multicultural environments across Asia, Europe, and Africa. I now hand over the floor to VK to give his presentation. Over to you, VK.
Thank you very much, Karma, for a very kind introduction and setting up the stage. I would also like to thank my colleagues, Eric and Johnny, for providing very interesting and useful information with regards to the co-benefits. And I particularly like the Eric's explanation on the interplay of development, co-benefits, and climate change. So Eric did also mention about the usefulness of carbon finance to promote co-benefits, and Johnny very rightly pointed out the quantification of co-benefits holds the key. So these two key elements, the carbon finance and quantification of co-benefits, is at the core of my presentation, which is built on the experience of the Future Carbon Fund that you just introduced. I would not like to labor to explain what are the co-benefits. My colleagues have amply clarified. So I would quickly come over to giving a short introduction of the Future Carbon Fund, which is a trust fund, as you rightly said. This is a post-2012 carbon fund ADB established as a part of its carbon market program. And one of the key objectives of this trust fund is to promote carbon finance, to promote greenhouse gas emission projects in Asia and the Pacific. Key elements of this trust fund has been to provide long-term contracts to projects which were being pursued as under the clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. So under this trust fund, what we were able to do is to provide fixed price contracts that was giving the certainty to the project developers, and also to mobilize co-financing in the form of upfront financing for the carbon transactions that we were entering into. So these two things were very important for the design, development, and actually successful implementation of the mitigation projects. Uh, Two things that we did during our portfolio building, as a matter of experience sharing, is we were very careful in selection of our projects that we were supporting. We wanted to build a portfolio that were not only reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also bringing a host of co-benefits for the local communities and probably beyond. So this was very important. And the second thing that we did was, in some of the transactions, we made it mandatory for the counterparts to provide for the co-benefits as a part of the project design, conduct a very active MRV, and provide ex post assessment of the co-benefits that were very nicely built into the commercial transaction that we had built in buying carbon credits. So with that, let me come over to this next slide. In 2017, ADB conducted a field study on the projects which are supported by the Future Carbon Fund, and we published a report which is available on this link, Future Carbon Fund Delivering Co-Benefits for Sustainable Development. Very quickly, I would like to highlight the lessons we learned and the findings that we were able to discover. That the study very clearly amplified the notion that GHG emission reduction projects, if designed properly, not only reduce tons of CO2, but they also bring about a host of co-benefits for the local communities and beyond. This is very important. And the co-benefits that mitigation projects can bring about are very diverse, and beyond that we had thought, and some of those can be directly linked to the topic of this webinar, that is to reduce air pollution. I would quickly walk you into the next slide, which gives the findings of this assessment. The 34 projects that are being supported by the Future Carbon Fund in 11 different countries in Asia and the Pacific. What we did, we are buying more than 10 million carbon credits, meaning 10 million tons of CO2. But when we went out to the field to talk to the people, the beneficiaries of those projects, we realized that those projects are positively affecting the lives of more than 10 million people. So on the left-hand side, the picture that you see, that these projects are bringing benefits such like improved air quality or installation of renewable energy projects, which is contributing directly to energy access, improved education for kids, and like, for example, as you can see at the right-hand side, more than 5,000 women have been empowered by this portfolio of projects. So what we are trying to say here is that the portfolio project supported by FCF, which was primarily to provide carbon finance to support mitigation projects, has been successful not only in reducing tons of CO2, but also bringing about a spectrum of co-benefits for the local communities. The second thing that we did, which you can see on the right-hand side, is we tried to map out all these co-benefits which are delivered by the FCF projects to the respective SDGs. So while conducting this study, we had identified 13 impact areas. And once we got our quantitative feedback from the individual projects through our team, then we tried to map those out to different SDGs. So as you can see at the bottom, that what we found, which was very interesting, that the projects are contributing to 16 of the 17 SDGs, which is very, very important. And that means that the portfolio that we were supporting is bringing about a quite wholesome set of co-benefits for the local communities. This is one example, the project that we are supporting in Bangladesh. This is supporting brick kiln industry, the installation of hybrid Hoffman kilns. My colleague Johnny mentioned very rightly about it. So this project is bringing sea change in the technological utilization in the brick kiln industry in Bangladesh. It brings about air quality improvement. As you can see, we have mentioned 75% less particulate matter. But in addition to these, which are meaning reducing tons of CO2 by way of reduced use of coal, and that immediately brings about reduction in the air quality, but it also brings other types of co-benefits like, first of all, it brought new technology into the country, women empowerment, as you can see in the picture, and also the improved quality makes a direct impact on the crop production in Bangladesh. So this is one example of the projects that we have supported through Future Carbon Fund. Key lessons, I know I'm running slightly over time. key lessons for us, that the project design maximizes co-benefits. So it is very important to design the project in such a manner that not only it achieves its key objectives, the main objective, but it also brings about co-benefits for the local communities. The second one is, to achieve this, it is very important to have an open and continuous dialogue with the local communities in the decision making about whether it is about the project or its implementation or its operations and maintenance over a lifetime. This is very important. Third thing, most of the projects are done by the private sector. The quantum and the type of co-benefits any project is able to bring about is also a function of the corporate philosophy of the project entity. So it is very important the kind of partners that you choose in running about a project. The fourth is the role the governments can play. You know, the co-benefits are a byproduct of a project which works in an ecosystem. So it is very important for the government to create an enabling environment.
Sorry, can you please turn off your mic if you're not speaking? I can hear a gentleman. I think he's talking on the phone.
Thank you. Thank you, Kama. So it is very imperative that the governments create an enabling environment for the successful operation, not only of the project, but also to make sure that the policy framework is so apt that it also inspires the project developers and the sector players to bring about a host of co-benefits for the local communities. And the final topic, I'll link it back to Eric's point, that the delivery of the co-benefits is a function of what kind of incentives we are able to provide to them. So it is very important that there are incentives for all the stakeholders in the design and development of the project, that co-benefits are brought about. And that's where the carbon markets can come and play a very important role, as we have seen from FCF. In some of the transactions, we were choosing a pricing policy that was linked to the quantum and the type of co-benefit the projects were able to deliver. In some cases, we were able to negotiate through transactions which made the delivery of certain quantity of co-benefit as a kind of milestone for the receipt of carbon finance, which oftentimes work in a results-based mechanism. So moving forward, what I think is this element of delivery of co-benefit is going to be very important. Carbon markets can play a very important role because the delivery of co-benefits, as I said, requires incentives, and carbon markets can provide a very important channel to mobilize those incentives for the project entities. We have delivered co-benefit through carbon finance under Future Carbon Fund, but I'm quite sure that we can also mobilize similar kind of incentives through the new market mechanisms which are currently being discussed under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and also the joint crediting mechanism, which is promoted by the government of Japan. So I'll take a stop here. We'll be very happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, VK. It's really heartening to know. Usually, when you think that this is a carbon fund or a climate change project, the emphasis is just on the greenhouse gas emissions or the climate adaptation. But there are all these hosts of other benefits that we usually don't think about. So it's great to know that. Before we take questions, maybe we can quickly move on to the next presentation from Green Climate Fund. So I would like to introduce our next panelist, the only lady panelist for today, Dr. Anya Grobicki. She is the Deputy Director for Communications and Public Relations in the Division of External Affairs at the Green Climate Fund, which we all know is in South Korea. She is from South Africa and a chemical engineer who worked for a major oil company and subsequently completed her PhD in biochemical engineering at the Imperial College in London. For 6 years, she was the head of the Global Water Partnership, which is a worldwide network of water organizations. She served as the executive secretary of this network, which was based in Sweden. And then after that, she also served as the Deputy Secretary General and Acting Secretary General of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. She has written a number of publications on water and development-related issues, most recently as coordinating the lead author for the freshwater chapter of the 6th Global Environmental Outlook. So again, there are many more achievements of Dr. Anya, but in the interest of time, I've just highlighted a few. So Anya, I would like to hand over the floor to you, if you can please make your presentation.
Thank you so much, Karma. And I would just like to check that you can all hear me and also that you can see my screen.
I can hear you and I can see you, but yes, and I can also see your screen now.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I'm very grateful to ADB for inviting me to come and speak about the GCF's requirements for climate financing. And I'll be happy to take any questions after this talk, and also to talk more about the role of co-benefits in the project. As you know, GCF is the financial mechanism of the Paris Agreement, with a mandate to promote low emission and climate resilient development. And we have a growing portfolio of projects, both in adaptation and in mitigation. Our mandate is to try to balance both adaptation and mitigation as evenly as possible in the allocation of funds. And also we have a number of cross-cutting projects, so I'll show you how that looks. But just a quick history. So the Green Climate Fund was originally established at COP16 in Cancun 10 years ago. The first board meeting was in 2012. The Secretariat was established in South Korea in 2013, but it took until 2015 before the first projects were approved. So in a sense, the fund itself as an operational fund is really only 5 years old. So we operated with the initial resource mechanism of about $8 billion for the first 4 years of the fund. And then last year we had a successful first replenishment where the countries pledged just under $10 billion for our next 4 years of operation. So currently we now have 143 projects which have been approved for a total of $6.2 billion, leveraging a co-financing of about 3 times that amount. We work very much as a partnership organization. We have 99 accredited entities and direct access entities, which are at the national level, through which the projects are developed and implemented. And currently, the projects that are actually under implementation are operating in 106 countries. So if we focus on the Asia-Pacific region, you can see that Asia-Pacific is currently receiving about 1/3 of our allocated investment, with 58 approved projects, and of which 45 are already under implementation. So what do we look for in projects? Obviously, because we're the Green Climate Fund, the climate rationale for the project is extremely important. So the additionality's got to be there. It cannot just be a development project. It's got to be shown how climate change is affecting the people involved, and how the project is addressing those climate impacts, or how the project is reducing carbon emissions. It's very important also that projects should be crowding in additional financing on top of the GCF financing. We are country driven in the sense that it's very important for there to be a high level of country ownership of every project. And if you look at our 6 investment criteria, as shown on this slide, all 6 of those investment criteria need to be high, rated high for a project to be approved, but I'll go through that in more detail in a subsequent slide. These are the 8 broad results areas where we operate, 4 roughly in mitigation, energy, building cities and industries, livelihoods, and forests and land use, and transport, and 4 broadly in adaptation, which is ecosystems, livelihoods, health, food and water security, and infrastructure. Resilient infrastructure is classed under adaptation. We have a number of requirements in terms of the compliance with GCF policies and the completeness of the documentation that's submitted with the project proposal. And I'll go through that in a little more detail as well. But first, let's have a look at the investment criteria. So the impact potential, if it's a mitigation project, it's got to be, the greenhouse gas calculations have to be done, and there have to be expected emissions reductions for the project. And we do look, for example, at the dollars per ton of CO2 equivalent that is avoided by the project. In terms of adaptation, we look at the social and environmental benefits as well as health co-benefits. And the key metric here is the number of beneficiaries, so the number of people who will benefit from the project. Paradigm shift potential, very important for GCF. There needs to be a catalytic impact for longer term change through the implementation of the project. This can be done through changes of the policy environment, legal frameworks, regulatory frameworks, and also through replication and scale up. Sustainable development potential needs to be high in terms of the co-benefits, as we're discussing here: economic, social, environmental, gender, and also health co-benefits. The needs of the recipient need to be high. We focus on the least developed countries. We focus on the poorest and most vulnerable communities. So in other words, the needs to be shown the climate vulnerability of the population and the financing needs. In terms of country ownership, we require alignment with all the nationally determined contributions, the national adaptation plans, engagement of the relative stakeholders, and the countries involved need to supply a no objection letter through their nationally designated authority. And finally, the economic and financial viability of the project has to be clear in terms of the cost effectiveness, the co-financing, and the economic and financial soundness of the project. So it's no small feat to submit a project to the Green Climate Fund. Documentation can run into hundreds of pages because there are many annexes that need to be attached to the project's proposal itself. So in addition to the no objection letter, as I already mentioned, there needs to be a detailed feasibility study giving the rationale for the design, structure, and costs of the project, a detailed budget, a procurement plan, environmental and social impact assessment. There needs to be a gender assessment and action plan, very important, in line with the gender policy of the GCF. Risk assessments, log frame, stakeholder consultations need to be held in advance of the project and, of course, an implementation schedule. Now, we do have projects which have a simplified aspect, but these are much smaller projects. So our simplified approval process, or SAP, means projects that are ready to be scaled up with potential for transformational impact, but are requesting only up to $10 million, and with minimal or no environmental or social risks, so-called category C in terms of their ESS categorization. And so in terms of applying for a SAP, which can be a very useful forerunner to before developing a major project proposal, this requires simpler documentation, fewer pages, and easier form filling. So this is very much recommended, particularly for a first-time applicant for GCF funding. We also have a project preparation finance facility, so one can also apply for financial support to develop the bigger project proposal. And many countries do that also through the readiness funding. Let me give you some example, though, of some of the larger projects which have been approved by GCF in the Asia Pacific region. And so, for example, the Green transport in Karachi, total project size of 583 million, which includes a substantial amount of co-financing, avoiding approximately 2.6 million tons of CO2 equivalent. And then there's an example of a RED Plus project in Indonesia, where the total project investment is 103.8 million. And this is in terms of the RED Plus mechanism. I'd like to briefly come back to the readiness support, because this is very important. Every country can access up to $1 million per country per year in terms of readiness support, which includes funding for NAP preparation. It can include project preparation funds. It can include development of other policy frameworks and stakeholder consultations and a lot of the preparatory work that goes into developing a major project for submission to GCF. So up to now, there have been 120 readiness grants approved to a total of 83.4 million. The readiness funds, we could say that countries are not yet fully making use of these readiness funds, and I would really encourage, particularly if you want to do studies of co-benefits, that readiness funding could be a mechanism to support such feasibility studies in preparation for including those co-benefits in a project proposal. We also have a very strong focus on supporting the SIDS and the small island developing states, particularly in Asia Pacific, and the SIDS have made good use of the readiness funding that's available. So here's an example where the Ministry of Climate Change in Vanuatu has affirmed that the readiness support was really essential in supporting their stakeholder consultation, technical analysis and design to underpin their project proposal on climate information services and early warning systems. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take any questions that people might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Anya. Very clear, comprehensive presentation, and a lot of the processes, it sounds very familiar, just like ADB. But fortunately, since ADB is also, I think, an implementing entity, so for projects where we are co-financing, ADB and Green Climate Fund, because we need all these documents, similar documentation for ADB projects. So by way of doing that, we kind of also GCF's documentation requirements are also met. So maybe we'll take a few questions and comments from the audience. So there is this question addressed to VK. VK, if you can please turn your camera on. This is from Rosanna. And I think this is about the project under the FCF that you had presented earlier, whether it takes ecological, economic, and social sustainability into account when assessing different methods, and whether costly technical projects are sustainable. BK, any response on that question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yes, it is very difficult actually to find the economic viability of projects of this nature, because this project actually involves the technology transfer for the first time. So from the economics perspective, the financial intermediary, they mobilize carbon finance to defray some part of the cost, to provide some financial incentives to the individual kiln owners. So actually both the projects that we are supporting are a bundle of 7 individual brick kiln owners. So they are getting finance from the intermediary or financial institution, which has pursued this as a CDM project, and they've been selling carbon assets to mobilize additional financing to do the gap funding for the project to become viable for the individual kiln owners. And more important than that, for them to continuously run the projects in such a manner that they continue to bring about positive environmental benefits for the people. In terms of meeting with the social and environmental standards and requirements, yes, the projects have been very closely monitored and they have been complying with the national policies. We have checked the projects to comply with ADB safeguard policies, which you are aware are very stringent, and the projects are continuously monitoring all these data, and that's what actually qualifies them to be part of FCF portfolio. Thank you.
Thank you, VK. A question for Anya. This is from Erin. So with these the projects that the Green Climate Fund is supporting, what are some of the common mistakes or pitfalls that applicants to the GCF have made, which resulted in the applications not getting approved? So I guess it's like trying to understand the common mistakes or perhaps gaps in information and things like that, based on your experience.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. So one important aspect is really to have a very sound theory of change for the project. It's got to be clear, what is the paradigm shift that the project is setting out to achieve, and exactly how are the project activities going to bring about that paradigm shift? Whether it's through policy change, whether it's through sort of large-scale replication of the project and so on, that it's going to make a significant impact. Now, the theory of change is very important, and it actually has to be harmonized with the log frame for the project. And then in the log frame, you've got to have your indicators very well set out to be able to actually monitor that the impacts of the project then are going to be what you claim they're going to be. So I think very often projects fall down because of the insufficiency of the theory of change and the log frame, where the board or the reviewers are just not convinced that the project is going to deliver what it claims it's going to deliver. And the second aspect of that is really focusing on the climate drivers of the project. Within that theory of change, the climate drivers have to be very clear, and then how the project is actually going to be working on those climate drivers, whether it's for mitigation or for adaptation, it's got to be shown very clearly. So I'd say it's that lack of clarity, which comes from the original project design. Really, that's a fundamental thing. If the project is clear and convincing, then of course you can always, supply more information, supply more evidence. But as long as that skeleton is convincing in the first instance.
Thank you, Anya. Actually, I have also, personally, I've been involved in applying for a project to the Green Climate Fund, and yeah, it did not get approved. So I agree with what you say. The reason was something else, but thank you for that information, because I think it's important for our government counterparts as well as for other stakeholders who would like to apply for projects for funds to Green Climate Fund to understand what are the main reasons where projects fail to get approved. So thank you for that answer, Anya. We do have a lot of comments from the audience, but I think in the interest of time, we should push forward to the third section of the webinar, and maybe we can come back to the comments later during the last round of Q&A. So we have a fifth panelist, and he did not make a presentation. So I would like to first actually begin with introducing our fifth panelist, Dr. Supath. Dr. Supath, if you can please turn your camera on. So I cannot see, is Dr. Supath's camera on? Yes, he is.
Yes, I'm on.
So hello, good afternoon, Dr. Supath. Thank you very much for for being a panelist for this webinar. So we'll shift a little bit into tapping into Dr. Supat's knowledge in the policy making process within the government institutional structure and the institutional coordination mechanisms, keeping in mind co-benefits. So Dr. Supat, you have this long experience in working with the government in Thailand, particularly dealing with managing the environmental issues in Thailand. So when making policies on air quality management, and this is particularly in Thailand, do you also consider climate change in the process of the decision making, or are there any other co-benefits that are taken into consideration while making air quality related policies? So this is my first question for you.
Yes, thank you, Kama, for the question. In the most recent plan to tackle particulate matter problem in Thailand, which has just been adopted by the government around the end of last year, the co-benefit to climate change also been considered, but it's not really explicitly. It's the kind of implicitly in the decision-making process, because when we are selecting what kind of policies and measures to be taken to reduce emission of particulate matter, focus is still on air pollution and benefit to the health of the people. If air pollution will be reduced, air quality will be improved. But at the same time, all the measures which been adopted will be also beneficial to climate change. For example, the major source of PM in Bangkok is actually from diesel vehicle. So by taking steps to reduce emission from diesel vehicle, we also reduce black carbon, which is one of the main short-lived climate pollutant, as mentioned earlier by Eric, and that also been taken into account. But it has not really been quantified how much the black carbon will be reduced. The quantification is on the PM. Mm-hmm. But it will be very easy to do the calculation how much black carbon will be reduced by looking at the content of the BC in the particulate matter. But that has been taken into account. And the other benefit also in consider, for example, when we are trying to improve the air quality in Bangkok, the transport system will have to be improved in order to reduce traffic congestion. So the mass rapid transit are under construction in order to bring people from the suburb area into Bangkok without using the personal car or personal vehicle. And that will provide also benefit in terms of the energy consumption of the country will be reduced, and so on and so on. So the measure which can provide multiple benefit will be very attractive to the government to take into the process.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. Thank you for that response, Dr. Supat. And if I can still engage with you a little bit more, since you didn't have a presentation. So you had mentioned about, you had discussed about how by way of looking at air, improving the air quality, there are ways to measure and quantify the climate change impacts. So in terms of the different agencies, now I have worked in the South Asia department, and I know very often that the climate change department is a unit under the Ministry of Environment in the government. And of course, there is some form of coordination, but sometimes it's still at the same time, it can be quite siloed. It can be quite, different in the approaches that is followed in promoting their own agenda. So in the government of Thailand, what is the kind of coordination that took place between the environmental agency, which is regulating air quality, and the climate agency in the government? Is there any kind of coordination that went on?
Yes, it is, but it is no difference from what you have said. You know, it's still being a silo. I mean, the department which is in charge of the environmental pollution is the pollution control department, also regulating the air quality, in which I have been working for that department for more than 30 years, and I'm retired now. but it is true that the coordination between the agencies is still weak. Although they are in the same ministry, the department which is in charge of the climate change issue in Thailand is the Office of Natural Resources and Environment Policy and Planning. It's also under the same ministry, but very difficult to talk to each other, because the pollution control department still will focus on environmental problems, air pollution, water pollution, waste problem, and the other agency will then focus on climate change. But sometimes we also talk to each other as well through the mechanism within the ministry, because at the national level, Thailand has a National Climate Change Committee, and that committee is chaired by the Prime Minister. And the vice chair is actually the Minister of Environment, and the permanent secretary of the ministry is the secretariat of the committee. So once everything will then be coordinated through either directly between the two departments or through the permanent secretary, which is actually the civil servant head of the ministry. But I still have to admit that it's still quite weak in terms of coordination.
Yes. So I think this co-benefits approach is actually one way which will kind of force the different agencies to sit together, because you have to look at the benefits together. So it's
not only limited to within the ministry, it's also to other ministry as well, because the benefit obtained from the transport sector, and that is handled by the Ministry of Transport, and from the energy sector as well. When we are implementing measures to reduce particulate matter from open burning of biomass, one of the ways is to use those biomass as fuel, and that will then deal with the energy ministry. So we have to talk with them. We have to talk with the Ministry of Energy. How can the biomass from the agriculture sector can be used as fuel in order to reduce the burning of the biomass openly, and that actually also generate a lot of particle and black carbon at the same time, which can produce both air pollution and climate change.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Supat. So if I can just maybe go back to Anya. So there was a question from the audience, Anya. I actually have a question for you as part of the panel discussion, but first perhaps we can take this question. Has the COVID-19 pandemic changed or is changing GCF's policy on the concessionality terms of the loan offered through accredited agencies, considering that some countries such as Mongolia face reduction in loans from commercial banks? So is there any changes in the terms because of COVID-19? Anya, over to you.
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So as you know, GCF offers concessional loans already, as well as a range of other financial instruments, such as guarantees and also equity. Now, we're looking at supporting a range of new instruments which could really help to de-risk investments and make it easier for countries to invest through their stimulus plans. And in particular, for example, we're looking at for the SIDS to see if there could be the setup of multi-country sovereign-backed guarantee funds where the AAA rated countries could join forces with other countries in order to make it possible to actually back and de-risk investments. There are a range of mechanisms which we're using, and in terms of existing projects, obviously there's now a lot more flexibility in terms of implementation of the projects, no cost extensions, but you know, we're having to really take it as it comes, and then GCF is also working with a range of other financing institutions to try to bring new financial instruments to bear in the current financial climate. Thanks.
Thank you, Anya. So I suppose your answer right now has kind of partly answered the question that I was planning to ask you, but perhaps I can still ask you. This is more looking towards the technical kind of project. So is there any, you had mentioned that actually you try to balance between both mitigation as well as adaptation. But is there, sort of going forward, is there any prioritization in terms of, let's say, because, you know, we know that transport-related emissions is a big factor for climate emissions as well as for air pollution. So will you be providing more emphasis on projects of that nature, or agricultural waste burning? Is there any direction that is being looked into by the Green Climate Fund?
Well, in terms of transport, there's a new sector guide that's being developed for, you know, developing and implementing clean transport projects and increased mobility. And another sector which is rapidly becoming more and more important is the cooling sector, and to you know, increase efficiency and reduce emissions from the cooling sector according to the Kigali Agreement. So that's another really important area.
Oh, interesting, because on one hand we have the heating sector and we also have to think about the cooling. They all need different kinds of energy. Thank you, Anya. I will move on to VK. If we can continue the discussion that you know, you began earlier with your presentation, and you mentioned this study on delivering co-benefits for sustainable development. So could you tell us a little bit about the main challenges that you face while integrating co-benefits, and going forward, what opportunities do you see for increasing focus on co-benefits in project design? VK, over to you.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much, Kama. This is a very interesting question, actually. We face a number of challenges while conducting this study. I'll try to enumerate a few. First of all, what we found out, there was no baseline information for the projects that we had supported. Because some of the projects, when they were developing the project, they had not done any baseline assessment of what kind of situation is there on the ground. So that kind of, you know, we did not have that kind of a basic information. But more important than that, when we were doing this ex post analysis of the project supported by the fund, we found out that the companies or the project owners within their own institutions, they were not having any integrated systems or processes for a very scientific monitoring, reporting, and verification of the co-benefit, and least of all, disclosing those co-benefits in the public domain. So that was one thing that we found out. And in addition to that, what we also figured out that there was in the host countries, which were our developing member countries in Asia Pacific, there were no regulatory requirements for the project owners to do MRV of the co-benefits and disclose or report those kind of co-benefits in the public domain. The most of all, in terms of conducting the assessment, we also faced a problem that there is no standardized methodology for assessing the co-benefits of different types of projects. There's no methodology which is universally acceptable. So what that really kind of affects the consistency and transparency of the kind of co-benefit individual projects. So one cannot really compare the kind of different projects into different jurisdictions. So that was one of the limitations of our study and lesson learned. And finally, I would say conducting a scientific MRV of co-benefits right from the design to the development, implementation, year on year, could be very expensive for the project owners. So that could be really challenging for the project owners, and that at times really affects the kind of co-benefit that actually gets reported out of different projects. In terms of the opportunities that lie ahead of us, I would tend to believe that the monetization of externalities of the project and their inclusion in the investment decision making could be very important. And that can also improve the quality of the project portfolios over a period of time, and could also increase the flow of sustainable finance. So I therefore consider that the inclusion of co-benefits right at the project assessment stage is going to be very important, and that's a huge opportunities for the project owners and the countries to access finance. The second thing I would say that the consideration of co-benefits will also help project owners to hedge against the sustainability risk, and also help them to do the stress testing of the project, because projects usually have a very long lifetime, and during which the other factors do change significantly. So that therefore the assessment of the co-benefits right at the project design stage could be really very important. That's an opportunity for the project owners to consider at this stage. And picking up from the challenges that we faced, I would strongly advocate the development of a universally acceptable methodology to assess co-benefits from different types of projects, so that the, say for example, carbon asset buyers or fund managers can actually compare the projects in different jurisdictions and can establish what kind of price they would like to pay for carbon assets coming out of such mitigation actions. So this is going to be very important. And again, integration of co-benefits throughout the life cycle of the project, whether it is at the design stage or the development of the project, implementation, operation and maintenance, is going to be very important. And I'll roll it back to the point that I made. If the project owners are able to do this kind of a very strong integration of the co-benefits throughout the project life cycle, then probably this could be a very important channel for them to access financial incentives, including those through carbon markets. So moving forward from the carbon markets, that's where I come from. I think under the realm of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, there is a mention of sustainable development very clearly articulated under Article 6. So I would strongly advocate the negotiators and architects of the new generation of market mechanism to very strongly build in the element of co-benefits while agreeing on the rule book for Article 6, so that the project entities are strongly motivated and even required to do the assessment of co-benefits right on early stage, reported throughout the operations of the project, that can actually help them in accessing carbon finance throughout the cycle. So I'll stop here.
Right. Thank you, VK. Yes, I think actually by nature, a lot of the projects naturally have co-benefits. It's the documentation part which is usually missing. So this is actually a good segue into my question for Eric. So we have not had Eric and Jody for some time now. So Eric, if I may ask you this next question on, going forward, how do you think this co-benefits approach can be taken forward in Asia? And could we have something like what VK had mentioned right now, to have like a universal approach on quantifying co-benefits? Eric, over to you.
Thank you so much, Karma. And I mean, I think this conversation is flowing quite nicely. So what will it take to advance the co-benefits in Asia? So I fully support the suggestions that VK are making, that we move towards a more standardized, harmonized approach. And I think this is part of the story for sure. I think another piece of this is we already have a lot of tools out there for quantifying and measuring the co-benefits. And some of these tools work in particular sectors. So for instance, we're working with colleagues in Mongolia right now. We have a tool to measure co-benefits from heat-only boilers. We're also going to be looking at solar energy. And some of these tools actually work across multiple sectors. So I think there's a need, not just for tools for their own sake, but for tools that are robust, but at the same time user-friendly. I think one of the key points is that policymakers might not need to actually use the tools themselves, but they need to be able to work with people that are using the tools so they understand some of the calculations and some of the decisions that go into, for instance, differentiating a project with, reductions of 5 tons of PM 2.5 from a project with the reductions of 25 tons of PM 2.5. And I think that's a key point, is to try to understand what types of things you can do to change a project by using these tools so that you get more co-benefits. And then the third thing is, I think, I mentioned this previously, but I think it's crucially important that we think not only in terms of projects, but also policies. So we're seeing a lot more attention now in the nationally determined contributions that countries are pledging to the UNFCCC, of mention of SDGs, and then in some cases, the SLCPs, the short-lived climate pollutants. I think this is really important because once we've identified a good set of projects, of course, I think the carbon finance can come in and help cultivate and foster some of those projects. But part of the motivation here is to also to have countries investing their own resources and taking ownership of these projects. And as a way to scale up projects, I think we need to think about more integration between our climate change and our other sectoral policies, whether that be in an NDC context or a transport policy context or an agricultural policy context or a wastewater policy context. So the projects and policies need to be aligned with each other. And then that gets to the last point that Dr. Spott raised, is I think from an institutional perspective, I mean, when I was in graduate school, and I was in graduate school for far, far too long, but one of the things that we used to talk about a lot is, when you're working for a different agency, is where you stand a lot of times depends upon where you sit. And the idea here is that if you sit in the Department of Climate Change, then it's difficult to understand why you would want to work on air pollution and vice versa. But I think we've seen some interesting ways of breaking down some of these barriers. And this sort of hooks back to the initial point that I made. So one of the ways is, I think, by using these decision-making support tools, we've seen in different countries, air pollution and climate change agencies, when they have ownership of a tool, a lot of times they're able to work together and find pathways that might not have been visible previously. So I think the sort of the standardization and harmonization of the tooling at both the project level and the policy level can also help bring together some of the institutions that are working on these issues and create opportunities for scaling up some good examples. So those are some thoughts from my side. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric. Actually, someone left a message in the chat box that they are working on a working paper on evaluation methods on harmonizing co-benefits. I'm wondering if this colleague is from, yes, Dr. Samad.
May I say something?
Sure.
On the
quickly,
quantification, on the quantification of the ACP has actually produced a white paper on the quantification of co-benefit, and there are some cases in that white paper. Maybe Ili can mention that on that particular white paper.
Right. I think Eric did mention it earlier in his presentation, and we will be sharing it as part of the webinar resource materials on the webinar webpage. Thank you, Dr. Supat. So if I may quickly move on to Joni, because we are, I think, almost going over time now. Joni, I have a question for you, and this is mainly got to do with your work with IPCC on how IPCC has all this climate change data from all over the world, and you are already working on the 6th assessment report, one of the chapters in the assessment report. And so based on the information that you have, what are some solutions that the government can implement? You had already kind of mentioned some of this in your presentation, but if you could tell us a little bit more about some more ideas on what kind of projects that governments can develop and implement with these multiple co-benefits. Joni, over to you. I think you need to unmute your mic, Joni. You're still on mute.
Yes, thank you. I think IPCC has 17 chapters, and this is very a big collaboration from different countries. And our chapter is focusing on the relation between climate change and SDG. One part of sustainable, how to connecting this, because this is kind of we afraid this is working separate. So in our infrastructure sector, we highlight about the co-benefit. I think Eric in charge in here, and also actually when we have our chapter also focusing on the social inclusion, how to make sure the poor people is not the most vulnerable for climate change, is not less impacted. So our case study in this here is mostly on developing country context. Some case study in developed, but most of the case study is we highlight about the issue transition of the fossil fuel in China, the clean coal, for example, and the problem of deforestation of palm oil in Indonesia to make it sustainable palm oil. We also highlight several how Ecuador to pursue the low carbon city. And so by protecting the poor, I think we already met the co-benefit itself. This is the most important among all. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Joni. I see that there is information from Rosanna about the local systems, where there is a brochure that has been presented comparing the use of biogas as biofuel. And I think Joni already, responded to this comment that this is called biochar. So thank you that you're already addressing some of the comments in the chat box. There is actually one question for Eric, which is from Shintaro Fuji. I think this is one of our ADB colleagues. And he's asking about whether, since you had in your presentation that slide that shows the reduction in PM 2.5 levels by 2030, do you think it will really be possible to reduce the PM 2.5 as shown in your slide? And what will be the major challenge for achieving this? And what are possible solutions that could address the challenge? Eric, over to you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Shintaro. And I mean, of course, this is a big ticket question. And so I'm a researcher who focuses on these issues. And so I'm very optimistic, and perhaps a little bit too optimistic sometimes, that you know, what we do can lead to positive change. So I am optimistic that we can achieve these reductions. I mean, as I mentioned, this report outlines 25 different solutions, but I think the key thing is that we need to be going beyond just the solution, either a technological or behavioral change, to think about some of the ways that the policymakers can mix these solutions together and achieve context-appropriate optimal outcomes. And I'll just give you one quick example to highlight how this could potentially be done. I mean, many of these solutions actually are not in urban areas, they're in agricultural areas. And so a colleague of mine and we're working on a paper right now that focuses on this notion of farmer field schools. These are sort of learning laboratories where farmers can learn different solutions to climate change and of course to increasing their yields. But they highlight that there's opportunities to work at the local level to identify solutions that are context appropriate. Then I think it's up to policymakers then to put together opportunities for not only funding these farmer field schools, but spreading them around in ways that can lead to, in this case, agriculturally sustainable solutions. That type of approach where local people are engaged in finding their own solutions and policymakers are engaged in scaling up these locally appropriate solutions, I think has a lot of legs. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Eric. We are actually beyond our time, so I think we should move to closing the webinar. And I would really like to thank Anthony Reed Harvey for all the information that he has shared. We will post that in the webinar site, and even the information that is shared by Rosina. Thank you very much. And Eric, I would like to invite you to actually close the webinar. But before I invite you, I would just like to thank again all the panelists for your great contributions and the great points that you raised, and also to the audience for the great participation. Over to you, Eric.
Okay, thank you so much, Karma. I think we had an extremely enriching and stimulating discussion that moved us from some of the definitional and conceptual issues regarding co-benefits to how it's being treated in the academic literature and this IPCC report, then to how co-benefits are being treated in climate finance mechanisms, projects, and then we had a good discussion of some of the opportunities and challenges to actually incorporating co-benefits at the policy level. And I think perhaps most importantly, this discussion was really an interactive dialogue. And I really want to extend my appreciation to Karma for creating such a nice back and forth, and also for being so brave as to hold 6 different webinars on air pollution. That's quite a phenomenal feat. Last but not least, I'd like to extend appreciation from IGIS and our colleagues at the Asian Co-Benefits Partnership to ADB and colleagues. You can see Bulgan there, and I know Chris has been behind the scenes as well as Chingy and others. These are the people that made sure that this project or webinar went off, and we're really, really grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, everybody. Wish you a great day ahead, a great evening ahead, depending on where you are. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Johnny.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Supa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karma.
Thank you, Kama.
Thank you, VK. Thanks a lot.